Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, my goodness. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here for the roundtable discussion, Political Diversity and Community Psychology. Is there room for conservatives? There may not be room in this room for anybody, liberal or conservative, but we'll manage as best we can. I'm Ron Harvey. I'm a PhD graduate of DePaul University's Community Psych program. I have a very brief introduction. We're going a little bit different from the format. There's long been a discussion of liberal bias in psychology, particularly in relation to social psychology. As a related field, community psychology expounds an explicit value for applied social action and is thus often portrayed as leaning towards the liberal or radical end of political ideology. Another community psychology value is encouraging diversity in multiple areas, including points of view. So the question is, how can the explicitly value-oriented and liberal field of community psychology welcome diverse political views? Although conservatives and libertarians are a minority in our field, I suspect, there still exist such people doing community work. How welcome do those conservative political minorities feel in community psychology? So to address that question today, we have a very, very distinguished panel and discussants. We have Tanya Hall from Chicago State University.
Hello.
Lenny Jason from DePaul University, John Moritsugu from Pacific Lutheran University, and Bradley Olson from National Louis University. And hiding somewhere in the audience is our discussant, Raymond Lorian. And so we're going to have this as a roundtable discussion. But what I'd like to do is have our participants argue their position or give an opening statement of their position from their assigned political viewpoint. John has to leave for an EC meeting immediately after his statement, but we'll go down the panel. We'll do conservative, liberal, conservative, liberal. And so, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. My apologies. I just got double booked. When I first got the assignment, I thought, no, that's not me. And then I thought, oh, sure, it'll be sort of fun. And I started to think how to do my best Rush Limbaugh. And unfortunately, then I started to think more and more about it, and I realized he's not conservative. He's really a caricature. And so from there, I went to my philosophy and religion and professor friends and talked to them a bit about conservatism. I guess also some poli-sci folks were thrown in there. And from that, I've come to a position that conservatives aren't bad. And when you hear what conservatives really are into, it makes sense to me. So in a way, this assignment may have converted me to be a part-carrying Democrat and a liberal, but there are conservative strains that may actually run through me and through us, and I think a discussion of what it's about is really very helpful. And so I thank Ron for really initiating this panel. So conservatives, I think, or a conservative position, I believe, would look to the facts. They're data-driven. They're empirically motivated. And forget the caricatures. Basically have their own things. But from a conservative point of view, if you think of the word, it means really sticking close to the facts. And if so, I don't see a problem with that. Number two, a conservative really values tradition. And quite honestly, I'm very much into culture, and I believe that traditions carry some very valuable symbolic lessons for us, and that we can perpetuate across generations. So if traditionalism or the honoring of traditions is a conservative point of view, I could agree to that too. So you see why, I don't know. The third part has to do with something that Ron had asked about. had mentioned, which is spirituality. And I am not a religious person, but I think I'm a spiritual person, and I believe that most of America joins me in that. In the definition of spirituality, at least as I've come to understand it, is a belief in powers beyond yourself. And so, I mean, that's community psychology in a way, isn't it? Sort of the idea of context in external variables and factors. And so, in a way, I am a spiritual person along those lines from a conservative point of view. And lastly, I got this just this afternoon talking to Mike Bond. Conservatives look to fiscal responsibility, and possibly. And my wife will tell you I'm very careful about my money, and I like to be responsible about where things are, and I like to keep track of those things. And so this assignment has turned me from a liberal.
Don't look at me.
I thought it was a conspiracy of sorts to a conservative in at least those ways. You know, as to, again, what's provided to us by the political system and the media folks out there, I don't agree with any of that. But at least from my understanding of what conservative may mean and can do, in at least those ways, I could see myself as a conservative, and I could see that conservative position serving as a valuable point for discussion in any of our work. And so, thank you very much. Got a nice 15 seconds left. Thank you very much. My apologies, but I do have to go, and I really am intrigued by the discussion that will go on in this session. So, thanks.
Thank you.
John, before you leave, if I were you, I'd be leaving too.
Thank you very much. Wise words.
So I think next we'll go with Tanya, who had the most time to prepare.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here representing the liberal position, and I took some notes, and I just wanted to make sure I share some of the ideas that I found in the literature. I've really been a liberal all my life, and Democrat growing up in Chicago, and that's just how it is for me. So it was interesting to receive this assignment to look at the research and the other side, if you will. And so I've developed some notes, and I'd like to share with you from the research. Now, this community psychology, really was built on liberal views in the United States during the 1950s and 60s. Now, during this time, community psychologists were really interested in moving away from the socially conservative ideologies and embraced more progressive liberal ideas of social change, with an emphasis on public health, prevention, and social change, like poverty, prejudice, veteran issues, etc. So the community psychology perspective was liberal, as determined by the Swampscott Conference of 1965, which really strongly encouraged community psychologists to be liberal in their political states. In particular, they focus on social change, public health, and prevention, as stated before. So with that, just establishing that, I looked at some research articles, and I'd like to share just a few because I know I just have a little time. But Hirsch was particularly interesting, Hirsch of 2012, and they differentiated between conservatives and liberals, and they stated that, well, liberals, they tend to be more spiritual, they look at equality, universalism, transcendence, whereas conservatives, they're really starkly religious. They need order, obedience, tradition. So, and all of these ideas, looking at another article from Hirsch, they talked about this difference also, and they shed some light, stating that, personality traits are really related to these liberal versus conservative ideas. And they talked about political conservatism as being restricted to change and acceptance to inequality. Well, that's not a liberal point of view. Political liberalism is really the opposite. It's accepting change and unacceptance of inequality. So I think that the differentiation is very clear. One more article, if I will. And that comes from Graham, who stated that these personality differences, and talked about morals. They talked about morals, and they talked about harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, respect, and purity and sanctity. And they stated that the conservatives typically focus on these, but the liberals are really into fairness and reciprocity and not doing harm and providing care. So just based on those definitions from these articles, I am a liberal. I think that community psychologists really are looking to improve social justice issues. And how can we improve social justice issues if we're not fair, if we're not, taking in consideration the needs and the struggles of the people? So with that, I am a liberal. It was very interesting, and I see that we're about to, my time is up, this assignment that we had to view a video. And the video comes from, it's post-partisan social psychology. And here, this social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, really talked about moving beyond, these stark liberal ideas and sort of taking in consideration of others as well. So I was almost changing my mind based off this video, but I'm sticking with my liberal philosophy to community psychology. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Next we have Dr. Jason from DePaul, arguing from the conservative point of view.
So first thing, I wanted to mention that when Ron tried to put this panel together, he actually asked me, and I said, well, I'll take the liberal position. But the problem was that he couldn't find anybody to take the conservative position. That's a statement, because he went to multiple people, and I eventually said, well, okay, well, I'll argue this case. But I think the fact that we have so few people that can say that they are a conservative in this field probably says something about our field. Let me kind of talk about stories more than some of the data that's been presented. I certainly have a history of being connected with the more kind of progressive movement. In junior high school, I campaigned with Johnson Humphrey, which got us into the Vietnam War. Because I did work at junior high school, next I basically worked for my congressman, young citizen Strelstowski. So when I was a senior in high school, I helped get him elected. He ended up getting indicted and thrown out of Congress. My next experience was working with Bobby Kennedy, and when he got assassinated, I said probably the best thing for me is to stay out of politics. Finally, at Brandeis, I remember having a conversation with Susan Sachs, and she was talking about, let's go and rob some banks and really kind of shake up the system. And I said, oh, come on, Susan. And the next day she was in the paper, and she had robbed a bank, and they killed somebody. So I'm just kind of mentioning these things that my background is somewhat toward the left, in terms of my ideology. But with that type of ideology, one of my experiences was working with the police departments in Woodridge, Illinois. And I was called down to talk to them because they had a solution to youth access to tobacco, which I had worked on for many years. And I remember going to the police department and sitting outside, and I was going to meet this, this police officer who was a DARE officer, and he wanted me to meet his people. So I was sitting out there, and then I get buzzed in, and then I was waiting there again, then I get buzzed in, and then I'm sitting around a table, and there are all these guys who are like twice as big as me, and like I'm like this small little guy, and there's the chief of police, chief of detectives, chief of this, chief of that, and I'm sort of saying, what am I doing here? These are all police. And I'm sort of from the 60s generation, and here I'm talking to police officers. Well, it was a very daunting experience for me, but it turned into be a really interesting collaboration for many, many years, for a couple decades. But the thing that was interesting is we came up with a policy that involved trying to help minors go into stores, and if they sold tobacco, they would get consequences, the store owners. And if you smoked tobacco, they would get like a ticket. And that approach actually worked in Woodridge, and then became a national legislation and signed our amendment, and now is implemented through 50 states. So that youth cannot get tobacco, which they could in the 1980s. Today, they go into stores, they're not going to be sold it. That's been an incredible landscape change, and yet the tobacco industry had supported focusing on merchants, not necessarily through fines and compliance checks, but through educational approaches. But because the tobacco industry had said we should try to get merchants not to sell minors tobacco through educational approaches, which don't work, the tobacco researchers and the tobacco activist group were against doing anything involving retailers giving access to tobacco. So for the last 20 years, the large group of tobacco researchers in the United States and the major tobacco advocacy organizations of researchers have been against these policies and have argued that we are wasting resources trying to get minors not having access to retailers. So I've had an interesting situation where, as a social scientist, someone who helped develop some of these procedures, I had active debates with people from the scientific community on this issue. So if it was youth, basically we should let them have access to tobacco, but not to alcohol. And if it's adults, of course, we should have smoke-free environments. But for youth, it's okay. I mean, it made no sense to me. And the data and the research that I was trying to do, and then I basically was able to publish, ultimately, the people who had opinions without data decided that this was an area of research that should not be supported. So I actually had to stop doing research in this area. That told me something interesting, something that I thought I was passionate about, that the scientific community had come up with something that this was not cool type research, forget the data. And I was basically interested in the data. Does it work? Does it actually help get kids less access to tobacco? Second quick kind of just story that's interesting, and that has to do with access to housing for people in recovery. I have been working with another organization for a couple decades called Oxford House. And Oxford House was really a really interesting innovation where people could self-govern and actually sort of have a place to go. So people who don't have family or connected networks have a place to live, and you can live there as long as you want, as long as you follow the rules, and as long as you don't take alcohol and drugs and pay your rent. So you go from an environment that's filled with different types of social networks to one that has workers, that has other types of positive things for recovery. And we've produced a number of studies over the last 20 years suggesting that this movement that started out with just one house and then spread to 10 or 15 houses and now has 1,700 houses in the United States and has houses in Africa, in Canada, in Australia, in different places around the world, it's a movement. There are 25,000 people who have lived in these recovery houses in the United States in the last year. It's the largest self-help residential care in the United States. And it has data suggesting it works. So the question I have is, why is it, given the importance of a group like this, that me at DePaul University and my team are the only people that have been studying this for over 25 years? Interesting, because the responsibility of individuals to self-pay to basically have to do it on their own? Is it a conservative ideology? There's something about it that hasn't gotten people interested. So when I started working with this in 1991, I said, boy, this is going to be something that's really cool. It's a laboratory. We can study empowerment. We can study sense of community. We can study social networks. We can study so many things in these environments. But then why is it our group is the only ones that's doing that? And I think there's something about this conservative, liberal sort of balance as to what's appropriate research, what settings we should align with, that has to do with our values, that I think in some ways maybe allows us to have certain opportunities and maybe have missed ones in other areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Lenny. Now we have Brad Leos.
Okay, so these debates are always fun because, I mean, in some ways you're playing a role, and in some ways you're not playing a role. And I'm going to try. I mean, but if I just play a role, it doesn't get at the truth. And if I just try to be myself, then it kind of seems weak. But I mean, that's kind of the point, is that there's a lot of complexity here. But ultimately, should we be a progressive, liberal, forward-moving field? I would say yes. And does that mean that we should have zero conservatives, or just exclude them from the organization? No. But am I concerned that that's hard to find a conservative to sit here? I'm not terribly concerned. I think there are plenty of conservatives in the field of traditional psychology, which is exactly what made people throw up their hands in the 60s and say, we need something new, we need Swampscott, and we need this new field of community psychology. And yet, that said, our field has always been set up as a field of contradictions. So Rappaport in the 1977 textbook says community psychology. Those two terms, that's an oxymoron. That the individual and the collective, in many ways, I mean, that's probably the start of his thinking on paradox. That we are a field of paradoxes. And yet, when Saracen tells us that we need to create these new settings, and we need to look at the history of what came before us to figure out, because any new setting is going to automatically create resistance. What came before it is going to say, you're doing something new, and it's an implicit rejection of what we're doing, and therefore we're going to try to stop it. And I think conservatism symbolizes a lot of that, what came before, and community psychology symbolizes a lot of what is the future. And so, of all the different definitions of of community psychology, again, Rappaport in his textbook basically came to the conclusion that there is no definition of community psychology, but what it is, it's a paradigm shift. That we are always trying to find something new. And as soon as we stop trying to find something new, which we could argue is a definition of the meaning conservative, to conserve the past, we start to no longer become a movement. We no longer are this sort of creative new entity for change in the world. So, again, none of this is really answering the question of, is there room for conservatives? I think there is room for conservatives, but that also begs the question, is what is a conservative? And I think that's an extraordinarily difficult question. Gordon Allport says in his 1955, one of my favorite psychology books, Nature of Prejudice, that the prejudiced person always says, "Oh yeah, some of my best friends are African Americans. Some of my best friends are gay. but ultimately the prejudice is still there. And I'd like to say, it kind of horrifies me to think I'm intolerant by saying, oh yeah, some of my best friends are conservatives. Unfortunately, if I said that, that would be a lie, because they're not. I don't have any yet, but may they be in the future? Possibly. Like Lenny's story with the police, I can see myself moving more and more in that direction, where there's trepidation interacting with people who hold very different values from us, but that's also really exciting, particularly when you can really come up with a creative, collaborative solution. So, with all of my work fighting the APA and being against CIA, Department of Defense, interrogations, all of these things, I've learned a lot through that process about. Am I done?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can finish your thought.
Okay, I'll finish that. But the bottom line is that Jane Marie Arrigo has always pushed us to talk to military intelligence people. We have a conference in September to bring the dissidents and a bunch of intelligence and military people to come up with an ethics policy, and so that'll be interesting. But Lenny didn't invite any police to become community psychologists, unless maybe he did. I'm not inviting any of them.
The rest of our discussion will be I'm going to pose two questions to the panel, to the person I directed towards. They have 3 minutes to answer, and the other panelists have 2 minutes to rebut. And then the last 10 minutes, we'll have Ray give his thoughts.
Offend everybody.
And then if we have any time after that, maybe we'll take one question from the audience. So this is a little bit different than our. Well, we have a limited.
A conservative organization.
if we have time.
Should we be obedient?
No, not if you're a community psychologist.
Just polite.
Well, Ron, I'm going to give up my 3 minutes so we can go out to the audience. I'm going to give up my 3 minutes so that we can have more audience participation.
Okay, good.
And I'll give up mine, too. That still leaves me with one liberal view. So.
Then I'll pose this question to Dr. Hall. Do you think that? But you'll have 2 minutes to respond to this. Do you think that community psychology is a closed, quote unquote? You saw the video. A closed tribal community that emphasizes certain sacred values that cannot be challenged.
Okay, I absolutely believe that. I think that liberals are really focused on, the. Let me just get my notes here. I just wanted to make sure I got thrown off. Sorry about that. Are focused on, empowerment and issues like that. So I think that the conservatives, they really are the opposite of what we're looking for. I think Lenny really described the difference. And, we're looking at social injustices and things like that. So I think we should really continue to focus on what we started and continue on in that area. So I think that's
beautiful.
And Ron, just a suggestion, that is, it seems like we've got just such a great list of people out here who have all types of views, and I almost kind of think we should let them get involved.
I'm an improviser. I'd be happy to do that. If anyone has a question, first hand, I saw that's the first hand I saw that went up. So I will ask your question. We'll give each of our members of our panel 2 minutes to respond.
So as I was sitting here, I was thinking about the views that you guys shared and how there are overlaps between our values and liberal values. And I wrote down a couple on my notepad because I think that these are things that a lot of us could agree about. Accountability and responsibility. This is something that I heard in a policy brief where someone identified as conservative but said this is how we really connect. And a decentralized government. I heard Brad Olson say he fights against APA and these big institutions. We also value empowerment, which is involving people, citizen grassroots, in contradicting big government. And also just having an efficient structure of governance. So I know in my own work, I really don't like the fact that 501c3s have regulations against lobbying, and it scares people from engaging in that citizen participation. It makes things really inefficient. But I think that these are ways that we really do have some similarities, and I just wanted to get you guys to respond to whether or not are we really sort of putting ourselves in a box, because possibly it's because of the portrayal of conservatism. It is often like Tea Party, and so sort of. I'm also reminded of this blog I read by APA, someone in APA recently, about how the issue isn't necessarily about gun violence and these bigger issues. It really boils down to this public ignorance. And if that's what it is, if that's the manifestation of the Conservative Party right now, that doesn't mean it's not reflecting, that doesn't mean that we don't have conservative values. It just means that it's a manifestation of public ignorance.
Great.
So
I'll let Lenny respond to that first.
And I'm just going to throw it out to the group out here, because I think it's a great question. Does anybody out here like to respond to that?
I'll just give one quick thought. So the idea of what is a conservative comes up in a lot of what you said, and I mean it's more complex than that. I mean, if we think of just like a circumplex where we've got sort of conservative, liberal, and then there's the more libertarian versus. I mean, there are people all over that spectrum, and there's probably many different moral values, many of which you mentioned. I mean, there's a lot of complexity there. And I really liked that John brought up the caricature of Rush Limbaugh, because I think that's part of the problem too. So we don't want to stereotype, but I would say that if someone is really one of those prototypical conservatives, it does tend to be about hierarchy. It's the values of hierarchy, the values of I mean, discrimination has become such a big part of what, for instance, the Republican Party and conservatives have become, and that does not mean that everybody's prejudiced. And even I would say that I have a lot of conservative values. I mean, I've got students coming in like Erica, who's sitting in the audience, and I'm like, wow, she's pretty radical. She's going to be trouble coming into the program. And then we have this super conservative student come in, and they were best of friends throughout the whole program. And so that diversity is good. On the other hand, if someone is such a prototypical conservative that they're really manifesting what conservative has become, then they're going to have trouble being authentic community psychologists. They're not going to be appreciating racial diversity. They may be for empowerment, but that empowerment is going to be a different type of empowerment. It's not going to be peer equal collaboration. It's going to be more top-down. So I would just say that I think that type of conservative is typically on the wrong side of history and typically on the wrong side of the future.
So can I just sort of real quickly talk about a historical issue? I think we should go to history, and we should think about, not just sort of kind of the American conservative kind of point of view, which tends to be somewhat extreme. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, if we look at Churchill and we look at Roosevelt coming together with very different ideology, and together they were able to create a force to actually sort of go against Hitler. And
Absolutely.
I think that's an example, and there's probably other historical examples where bringing together different political ideologies might have been critical for kind of some important points in history. So.
Mm-hmm. Dr. All, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I just want to say, sorry, I responded to that my first question with my introduction, and but I wanted to highlight this sort of tribal, moral community. I do think that we have a closed tribal community that emphasizes sacred values. And one criticism of that is that, there's taboos that constrain our thinking. Well, I think we should continue to move forward with our community psychology principles that are based on liberal ideologies. And another criticism that we have is that we have almost no moral or political diversity. Well, I think we should focus on our liberal perspective so that we can move forward with, community psychology perspectives. And last is that I was a little confused, not confused, but just wondering that it says we have created a hostile climate towards our non-liberal students. Now that concerns me. I want students to be able to voice their opinions and not feel like they can't talk about their perspectives honestly. And so I think we should continue with our liberal perspective and that people should know, but if I may say, I think that students should be able to voice their opinions no matter what side that they're on. So.
One more question, yes.
Just very quick, also on a historical
Sure.
note. When I started graduate school 35 years ago, before Reagan, the community psychology, at least what I was learning from Rappaport, was beginning to emerge as a criticism of the Great Society and the liberal programs, the excesses of those liberal programs. I don't know if you guys, I came in late, so I don't know if you talked about it, but the idea of blaming the victim, the idea of empowerment, which came from the American Enterprise Institute, Berger and Newhouse, the debates that were going on, Lenny and John will remember, prevention versus empowerment, those weren't together. Those were opposing polarities. Of the idea that you would have a professional class that would decide who's at risk and how to fix them, as opposed to allowing people to develop from the ground up. So I think that had it not been for Reagan, that community psychology would feel very different in where it sits on the political spectrum. We were so ravaged by what's happened over the last 30 years that I think there's been a lot of common cause between the clinicians and the medical model and the public health sector and community activism, because we're all being victimized by the kind of strident, arrogant, lying, racist conservatism that's taken over a large swath of the country. Anyway, you know where I said, but I actually think that real legitimate conservative values about the kind of balance between individualism, individual responsibility, individual autonomy, the role of community in people's lives, all of those things were questions that we were starting to discuss in 1980 when Julian's paper came out and got, I think, really buried under the politics of the last 30 years. So, but I think that goes to the young woman who was saying about, young from my perspective, woman who was saying that, beyond the rhetoric, I think there are questions like that we should still be taking hold of and not alienating people who want to ask those kinds of questions.
Sure. I want to give our panel just a brief amount of time to respond.
Well, we want. I think we've said enough, right?
Yeah.
I agree.
We've said too much. So why don't we have others jump in?
Unless you
got someone up there. Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
Now, Western liberalism has been heavily criticized within the field and outside for how it often sort of views or approaches, ways of living or ways of believing, particularly outside the United States, that are deemed as conservative or deemed as quote-unquote backwards. But sort of liberalism has often, Western liberalism has sort of approached in ways that have been deemed insensitive or condescending or almost colonial, right? And yet it almost sounds like we're sort of painting liberalism in this all great light within this context. But how do you see that playing out in the context?
It's absolutely a continuum. I mean, left to right, and it's incredibly complex. But I personally, I think some of the the debates, the most interesting debates to me are the liberals and the truly more radical folks. So I completely agree that we cannot sort of, I have trouble with a lot of Democrats in Chicago are essentially conservatives. So absolutely. I mean, that's an important distinction to make. There's great heterogeneity in all of these groups.
Rod,
I was just thinking that one of the first, I think, theories of social political development in the U.S. was racial identity theory. And one thing it found that either kind of like purely a stage model, or like you're not black at all in your identity and you're 100% black, continuum doesn't work. And what it ended up, largely through research, is thinking about really a profile where you have these themes and everybody has a different profile. Because this whole notion of like this radical, there are a lot of radical people on the right. Really radical.
Yeah, yeah.
And in some ways, if we're trying to preserve the women's reproductive rights, we're trying to conserve something that's already there. So we're actually conserving existing policies.
Absolutely.
So it's the idea that we want to change everything. We don't want to change everything. We want to change the things that we don't like.
Absolutely.
So social change is a kind of a meaningless.
Us radicals on the APA issue are trying to go back to the old ethics code, which is conservative. Absolutely.
Right. So I think if we think of profile, it gives a much more a set of dimensions
that's useful.
People have, rather than ordering them along some political continuum.
So for our last 8 minutes, I want to turn this over to Ray, and we'll continue the discussion, but I want to hear what our discussants' thoughts are.
And does anybody have a stone?
There's a projector.
Let me give you a quick story. In 1985, I started as the director of the clinical community program at the University of Maryland in College Park. And at about 1990, I had a set of students come up who had been assigned to a family and couples, or marital and couples counseling practicum. And a group of them came to my office as the director and announced that one of the students who had just been admitted the year before was in this practicum and had been assigned with another student to work with a gay couple. And he said, "I can't, it's a sin." And the lineup of students outside my office was demanding that I immediately terminate him from the program because he was against everything the program was for, given our commitment to diversity. My response was very simple, that everybody in the lineup was committed to diversity, but it had to be the right kind. And that I would terminate everybody in the program who was against diversity if they wanted me to terminate somebody who was against diversity, and that meant all of them. Because he's a Southern Baptist, you were part of the selection committee. He wasn't hypocritical. He didn't pretend he was anything but what he was, and you insisted that he should come. I think in some respects, part of the discussion today is, what is it that community psychology is or is not about? And when you talk about Reagan, I worked for Reagan as the Associate Administrator for Prevention from 1982 to 1984, and that's when the Preventive Intervention Research Center started. That's when the funding for public health service came from Reagan. So the notion that conservatives were opposed to that, what they've been for, I think, are some of the things, as Brad has said, that are just so extreme that they're silly. On the other hand, some of what, and obviously the last 48 hours have been a bad time for conservatives in this country. But stuff happens. But think about it. We can no longer fight for gay marriage. We could potentially join with conservatives and fight for marriage. Because if we're arguing that anybody should be able to marry anybody they want, and we're interested in reducing an incredibly critical risk factor for children and child and adolescent health outcomes, marital disruption, single-parent families, etc., are a major risk factor. So we can now join liberals and conservatives in fighting for that. We're against violence. and I've been involved in a variety of research that has to do with violence. But we have to figure out what we're going to do to replace the causes of violence in the inner city. One of the things, and I'm in a role now as the dean of the university, and the 4 conservative faculty that identify themselves as such in the university regularly complain about the fact that they are not allowed to voice their expression. But the real question is, and because as has been pointed out, there's a lot of overlap if we forget about the crazies like Rush Limbaugh. And as Brad knows, I've been involved in a variety of different involvements with the federal government. But the real question is
other governmental.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Not, shut up. But the real question is, when we talk about, let's not use the word liberal, let's talk about progressive. What's the progress we've made since Swampscott? And what's the progress we need to make? And to what extent do we need to take and merge? And, if you think about, most of us are at least viewed as liberal. Most of us are in ecologies that are overwhelmingly liberal. Most of us agree with most of us. But the people we have to change in terms of their attitudes and actions are typically not in the university, don't vote for the same folks as we do, are feeling a lot less well today than we are. And it's those people that we, in fact, and think about it, if any other subgroup in the country I referred to as those people would be offended. But it's their views we have to understand. It's, in some respects, their empowerment that we have to free up because they are bound by concepts that don't allow them to see that, when they wanted the false argument that we have to oppose gay marriage because of how badly heterosexual marriage is doing, the real issue is marriage. The real issue is commitments and relationships. When we talk about empowerment, and we talk about it, and Lenny's done some excellent work in terms of access to tobacco, none of us, although I think most universities would be offended, and they are offended, whenever you talk about restricting substances and substance use, except when we have to work with the individuals who have been victimized by substance abuse. So we would like a set of rules that keep people from engaging in those behaviors as long as they don't affect our engaging in those behaviors. And I think that's part of what community psychology has to move beyond, which is the certainty with which it holds its values. My understanding of the community mental health movement and of Swampscott is a bit different than other folks. I thought they were interested in going into communities because the people in communities were not making use of mental health services because the mental health services had not been designed with them in mind. And it was to change the providers of mental health services in a way that the services they delivered were aligned with the needs of those who needed services. The catalyst was psychopharmacology. The catalyst was psychotropic medications that conservatives saw as a way to free people from mental health institutions. And I think if we're going to be progressive, we have to identify exactly what the outcomes are that we're interested in. And I think there have been seeds, and in my comments tomorrow I'm going to talk about, there seems to be this constant tension between community psych using data to prove a point, but it's almost always data that proves a point. And the notion of why is it that we don't have we don't look at the contrary data and truly get into that kind of a debate, which is, I think, something that is critically important. This is an interesting, and I think the issue of why are there no conservatives, or almost no conservatives in institutions, other than I did a speech once at Liberty University, I could have said, why are there no liberals in the audience? and I really knew I was there because when we finished, I said, let's go get a drink. That didn't work at all. And I went home early from that meeting. But I think that's where community psychology has to stop being against things and be for specific outcomes. When I was in practice as a clinician, I would ask every new patient, I would say the following: let's assume I know what I'm doing. And let's also assume I'm really, really good at this. How will you be different when I finish? When we engage in an intervention in a community, we ought to promise the community how they will be different, and we ought to stay there till they're different. And that's, in many respects, the conservative mantra, which is do what you say you're going to do. Now, we don't agree in what they want to do, but they really keep pushing to do what they say they're going to do. Thank you.
Oh. Well, that concludes our roundtable, which turned in from a debate into a discussion for a little bit, and all sorts of great things. I'm really overwhelmed and appreciate your support here. We'll continue the dialogue in our social hours and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ron.
Thank you.
Nice work.
Thank you. How'd yours go?
That's all right. Thanks, Ron.